some outlines. I don't know. Did somebody get to pass them out for me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. We're going to continue on some of the thoughts we had from last week. So if you weren't here, last week was, there's probably an outline laying around about that one too. But last week we talked about the idea of go fish. And of course, Mr. John wanted to leave service and get in his boat and go last week, but we wouldn't let him. And but we also talked about that game, Go Fish, which some of you love to play. And we were reminded of what I call the Great Command of the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 18 and 20. And again, the Great Command of the Great Commission is not to go. The command is not in the word to go. The command is to make disciples. The idea of going is already there. The reason that you're going is because Jesus is going in and through you.
Right.
That idea. That the reason you have this desire to go is not because you know it's the right thing to do, but it's what He wants to do in and through you.
Amen.
You're filled with the Spirit. That's why you go. Because if you just go in and of your own strength, you'll eventually burn out.
Right. Amen.
And we have a lot of that in the church. The Christian burnout is really hard. So we just go on and say, look, if we're really going to be filled with the Spirit, we're going to have to learn about that rest we talked about last week too in Hebrews. And if God Himself could cease from His own works in the creation of the world, then why wouldn't we choose to rest from our own works and let Him work in us and through us? And that's the big deal about being a Christian. That's the big deal about Jesus sending His Spirit, the Helper, the Comforter, to come and live inside of you. Amen? That's a big deal. So that's what we looked at last week, comparing the idea of go fish to make disciples. This week we want to look into John. We're going to go to the end of John 21, of course, because again, we're just trying to pick up from Resurrection Sunday and kind of push forward this time. And in the Gospel of John, there's that beeping again, isn't that weird? 21. I mean, it's not even on, so I don't even know what it's beeping. Pastor says, the Lord sending you a warning. Is that what he said? Be ready, right? So here's the warning. Here's the command. And there's 3 commands here in John 21. So let's look at those this morning. It's interesting when you compare the 4 Gospels, the very end after the resurrection, they're all really kind of different, which is kind of interesting. So to read those together is really neat. So I think we might do that these next few weeks, just take one at a time and look at the scenario with the post-resurrection scene. In this case, John 21 is that. And as you begin in John 21, it's the 3rd time that Jesus showed Himself to His disciples after the resurrection. And as you know, John 21 is the last chapter of the Gospel of John. But in particular, he goes into this almost this confrontation with Peter. And it's interesting. And this really ties into last week too, because we looked at this. And as Jesus shows Himself, this is John 21, Jesus showed Himself to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. He goes down to verse 5. It's the morning. Jesus stood on the shore. The disciples didn't know it was Him yet. And He calls out to them, and He calls them children. He says, "Children, have you any food?" And they answered Him, "No." And He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast the net, and they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Now, prior to that, they had fished. In verse 3, if you look at that, they had gone fishing. Basically, let's think about it as going fishing without Jesus. Whoa. So they had gone fishing without Jesus. And Peter said, "Hey, I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We're going with you." So they went out. This is verse 3. Got into the boat, and all night, they caught nothing all night long. So the morning comes. Jesus says, "Got any food?" They say, "Nope." He said, "Cast the net." So they went and did it. And as they did that, they weren't able to draw in the net, right? It's that's a lot of fish to not be able to pull that net in. And so there's this picture of feeding, this picture of Jesus continuing to provide for his disciples, right? See, they can't go out in and of their own strength. So we call that merely existing. So you can merely exist through this life. We call it life of dead. That's what we call it.
Whoa.
You're kind of like Night of the Living Dead kind of thing. You're kind of going through the motions, right? You're going through your deal of life, but there is no real purpose of why you're doing what you're doing. You're kind of going through the motions. There's no eternal value of what you're doing. You know, you're without purpose. And of course, Proverbs tells us of that. Tells us about that, right? Without what? People perish without a what?
Vision.
Yeah, well, there's no vision, right? No vision, no purpose. People will perish. I love the translation. I think it's New King James. It says they cast off restraint, which is really different than just perishing. And I always use the picture of going on a roller coaster ride and just saying, hey, I don't need that restraint. I'm good with this, man. I can hang on myself. Until you get flipped upside down at 100 miles an hour. Right? See, it's just ridiculous to think that you would ride it without the restraint. So to think that you would live life without the restraining power of Jesus in your life would just be foolish, right? Utter foolishness. So again, here's Jesus again after the resurrection, reminding the disciples that they've got to trust in him. That he continues to provide for them. Even when they've toiled all night long and have caught nothing, he's always on time. He never fails. And he always provides. God's love always delivers. So there's the picture there as you see the scene coming down. So we'll just kind of read the story as we move into verses 15, 16, to 17 is what we're going to focus on. So therefore, this is verse 7 now. So they cast the net. They weren't able to draw it in, had a multitude of fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, so we were calling him John, right? John says to Peter, it is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and he plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have just caught. So Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. Did you catch that many fish after that?
That's pretty significant.
That's a lot of fish, isn't it? Yeah. And although there were so many, the nets weren't broken, which is really interesting. Right? And Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast. Yet none of them dared ask him, who are you, knowing that it was the Lord.
Wow.
It's really interesting. You got to go back and you got to read through this again, because this is the third time now he showed himself. And there's still this doubting going on. There's still this wonderment that's going on. Not saying it's good or bad, just saying it's there. It's a life thing. It's a real life thing. So Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. Now that would certainly cause some great reminders, wouldn't it? I mean, could you sit there and have this bread and fish with Jesus again and not think about the 5,000 that were fed, that you were a part of, man, as a disciple, right? Could you not think about the Last Supper scene kind of thing? Sitting there eating with Jesus, right? So it's like he's sitting down again. They're all freaked out. Of course, he's back again. He just fished all night, caught nothing. Here's 153 fish again. And then he's just kind of rehashing. He's just kind of bringing back their memory banks again. Like, hey, remember this? We did this together. Remember we did this together. And this is the kind of stuff. This is the way of life. And this is what we're going to continue to do, because this is about making disciples. So this is verse 13. Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. Now this is the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So I didn't just come up with that. It actually says it in the Scripture, which is really good, right? Verse 15. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He said to Jesus, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. Verse 16, he said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. And then verse 17. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Now I just want to look at those three of those words this morning in those three verses. Feed. Now I'm reading the New King James Version. If you have King James, it may say feed, feed, and feed. Anybody have King James? Okay. Anybody have a different translation than feed, tend, and feed? Feed my sheep. Or feed my lambs, tend my sheep.
Take care.
Take care.
He's amplified.
Good. We can hear him then. NIV is take care. Which verse is that? All three?
No, first time I said before.
Yep.
Take care.
Take care. Take care of my sheep. That's verse 16 or verse 15? What's 15 say? Feed. Feed my lambs. And you also see the lamb idea. I don't want to get into that this morning. We'll take care of that next time. Okay. So feed, tend, and feed. And the reason why New King James translates the second one as not feed is because there's a different word that they're using there. So they actually, during the translation of the original Greek, they actually said, hey, wait, there's a different word here. So we're going to call it tending. So the idea of feeding, for instance, John 21:15, feed. Okay, Jesus is doing that, isn't it, with his disciples. The disciples couldn't do that in and of their own strength. I'm sure they could have eventually caught a fish. I mean, every fisherman finds a fish. Every once in a while, right? I mean, even I can catch a fish once a year. These two throw their net, like I said, throw their lines out, and they just pull them in, and the fish jump out of the water for Joel McKay.
Wow.
But for me, it takes a while. I got to kind of coax them. Got to promise them that I'll, got to promise the fish something. But anyway, so here he's saying, feed, feed my sheep, right? The first one. Feed my lambs. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. So there's a definite difference. First thing you want to notice is that all three of those words are in the command form. So they're written in the imperative, which means it's not something that some of us get to do or some of us are supposed to do. All right? It's not a suggestion. And if you want to fulfill the commands of God, let Jesus do them in and through you. Does that sound good? I mean, if you really want to fulfill the commands, if you want to be able to say, hey, I can keep the commandments, then let Jesus live in and through you. Trying to do them in and of your own strength, you can't. I mean, the rich young ruler, remember him? He had kept those commandments, didn't he? But yet still something was wrong, right? Something was wrong in his heart. So let's keep that in mind this morning. So anyway, feed my lambs. Feed, tend, feed. Let me make this statement up front first. Feeding and tending to the world around, I should say, around us. Feeding and tending to the world around us is not just a social activity. Social justice has come up a lot lately. This generation of young people are really into social justice. They really want to go out into the highways and the byways. It's a big deal in colleges now, and universities. They want to go out and they want to get hands-on with ministry. They want to get out of the towers, so to say, the ivory towers, and they want to get involved in the streets. But one of the problems with social justice is that if it's just an activity thing, if there is no Jesus really behind it, if there is no real good, strong theology with that, if we don't balance that social justice, with what we're going to call a transformed way of life, then what social justice becomes is just another activity, another Christian doing thing instead of a Christian being thing. That makes sense? So I see you're taking notes, so I'm going to let you write those down. Of course, you can buy the video, right, John?
Right, $72 each.
And you get a bag of popcorn free, right, with that?
Right. And a chocolate bar.
Oh, don't put me down. Yeah. So feeding and tending to the world around us is not just a social activity. You know, hey, it's not just, you don't just come up and say, hey, you know what, I want to be a good person, and I want to go feed the homeless. See, when we began our homeless ministry, it wasn't that. It wasn't that, hey, you know what, we know there's some homeless people that need food. We're just going to go and do that because that's what Jesus would do. See, if you just do it like that, then eventually you'll quit doing it. You get tired of it. You'll get tired that you won't see all them coming to church right away. You'll get tired that you can't take up an offering out there in the woods with them. You're like, well, what can they give us? You know, you'll get that mentality of, well, now that I'm doing something for you, what are you going to do back for us in the church? See, and that's never how Jesus operated.
That's right.
He never went to the lame man at the pool and said, all right, I'm going to heal you, but when you get up, brother, you better tell the world around. Matter of fact, he said, don't tell anybody.
Wow.
That makes a lot of sense to me now. Why would Jesus... Yeah, I'm going to heal you, but don't tell anyone. So this is why it's so important that our doing Christian things. See, we've said this before. You can do Christian things and not really be a Christian. So feeding and tending to the world around us is not just a social activity, but it is the transformed way of life of Jesus living in us and through us. So the reason why we go out to the woods to feed the homeless is because there's this thing inside of me that I just can't get away from. It keeps me up in the middle of the night, and I just know that if Jesus is going to have his way in and through me, that's what he's going to do in and through me. I don't have to really plan for it. I don't have to really prepare for it. I'm just going to allow him to do what he wants to do in and through me. And then through that, he'll take care of all that. And that way I can give him all the glory and honor and praise. And that way when they don't right away come to church, or they don't right away give anything back, or there's not really a lot of so-called fruit in that part, it's not my deal. It's all up to him anyway. So I don't have to get upset. I don't have to worry. I don't have to quit doing it after a year and say, hey, you know what? We've done this for a year or 2 years now. We're not seeing any results, so we're going to quit doing this ministry and try to do something else.
Wow.
And that was the biggest deal in our church. If you read our book, Reclaiming the Heart and Soul of the Church, that the church really wrote, that I got to get credit for. If you really read that, you'll see in there that at that point, the pivotal point in the life of the church was really, you can almost pinpoint it to a board meeting where we were at a point in the ministry of the church where we were sending out 5 buses on Wednesday nights, drawing in children and ministering to hundreds a week. But then the gas prices were rising, and that month we spent over $5,000 just in diesel and gas. And it came to a point where the church was going to have to decide if it was going to be a ministry or if it was going to be a business. If it was going to be a business, then we'd have to quit doing that ministry, because we didn't have the funds anymore. And it was so costly. But if it was going to continue to be a ministry, then we were going to have to trust in the Lord.
Whoa.
And continue to do it.
Whoa.
And I can remember saying that if we quit on these kids, I don't know if we'll ever recover from it. So that began the downward trend of demise of the church. So we finally hit a rock bottom. And we're trying to begin now another way of redoing or doing church differently now, so that we are really wanting to be a place where Jesus is Lord and people are healthy.
Yeah.
So the increase is not going to be astronomically numerical, all like that. But if each one of us can become healthy, then I believe that the health that you possess will just ooze out onto those around you. And then your house. See, I'm more concerned that your house is healthy than there's 200 people sitting in this building. Believe me when I say that. I am so much more concerned that your new marriage lasts 100 years than this church building. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Yeah.
I am so much more concerned that when these two go off to college this fall,
Wow.
that their dorm rooms become light. The light of Jesus. That to me would be so much more important to go to be with them at some point during the week, or for us to travel there just to help them, than to be concerned about a particular building and what's going on. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. That doesn't get you church growth awards. It doesn't get you big churches to go preach at, you know. But that's okay. Because we're really talking about, and I'm not putting down big churches, believe me, I'm not, because I'm really not. I got saved in a large church, so thank God for a large church. I'm not putting down a large church. I'm just telling you where my heart is in my own life. You know, you just got to do what Jesus wants to do in and through you. You can't try to be something that He doesn't want you to be. So this picture here that He's given Peter, to feed and tend and feed. So Jesus, again, He continues to do what He calls you to do. He does for you Himself. They can't catch fish on their own. He catches it for them, and He draws them into it. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. Do you love me? Tend my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. The idea of feeding, of course, it's just that word, to feed. To feed sheep. One of the dictionaries talks about an idea to pasture, to feed sheep, to pasture or tend while they're grazing kind of idea. One goes as far as to say it's used metaphorically. One scholar was trying to read into it some and say, hey, this is metaphorically talking about Christian teaching, a Christian teacher meaning to instruct. The only issue I have with that is that when we begin to read into some things, then the whole idea of your talents kind of rise up and say, well, hey, I'm not a teacher, so this doesn't apply to me. Wow. So I want to go beyond that idea if it's just for a teacher, because I believe if you're a Christian, you're a teacher. Right. You're teaching somebody something. Yeah. If you're a parent, you're a teacher, whether you want to admit it or not. Yeah. And if you're a kid, you're a teacher. Because we see that in our school. Man, you used to see how the little guys are attracted to the big guys at school. So the big guys are teaching the little guys something. And the little guys are teaching the littler guys something. So everybody's teaching somebody something. So everybody's a teacher. So this idea of feeding. Now, I wanted just to have this one thought. I want to take this thought, and when I saw the word tend, feed, tend, feed. We know it's a commandment. We know that in order to fulfill the commandments, Jesus has got to do it in us and through us. When I thought of the idea of tend, I couldn't help but go where? Where do you think I wanted to go back to?
Genesis.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to go back. We're looking at post-resurrection, and I wanted to go back pre-fall. Because before the fall, Genesis 2, the fall, Genesis 3, a huge thing happens in our world. I mean, in the whole scope of the cosmos, I mean, this was a huge thing happens when man falls in Genesis 3. So go back to Genesis 2. And I just go back here because it's not like Jesus is trying to say something different. It's not like the plan of God has ever changed in any scope of the imagination over the course of time. You go right back to Genesis 1, when we're created in His image. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. That's Genesis 1:26, right? Let man have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created man, male and female. He created them. So we're created in the image of God. And when Peter tells us that we are now, after the fall, after the resurrection of Christ, after Pentecost, when he says we are now to be divine, partakers of His divine nature, he's drawn us back to this point in Genesis.
Wow.
That God's nature is love. And we are like Him because that's the essence of who He is, His love. See, He's never called us to be omniscient, all-knowing. That's a quality of God. That's not the essence of God. See, God could still be God and not be all-knowing. How about that one? God could still be God and not be everywhere at all time. It doesn't make Him God. What makes Him God is this love. God is love.
Yeah.
That's who He is. And He draws us into that intimacy and oneness of that love. And when we are in that intimacy and oneness of love, we are like Him. Not all powerful, not all knowing, not everywhere at all time. Those are qualities. Love is His essence. It's like, again, I use this picture, if you were to put Him on the operating table, open Him up, and love would just ooze out. I mean, that's what's in. He's full of love. Now, if God no longer was love, He would cease being God.
Wow.
Because He is love. That's something that He does, although He does love. But because He is love, because Scripture tells us He is love. And for Him to cease loving, He would cease being God. That's a big deal. So you move into that thought, and you see that picture of what He's drawn us back to, what He wants to complete, this whole plan of bringing us back to His original plan, of us being in His image. And you move into Genesis chapter 2, and all creation was taking place and so forth. God formed out of the dust of the ground man. Of course, He breathed life in the man and the Adam there. And then you move into chapter 2, verse 15. So after everything was created, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. Tend and keep it. Now remember, there's no other, at this point, Adam, he's the only creation right now. There's no other man. Eve's not created yet, right? According to Genesis 2 here, right? She's not created yet. So the idea of tending and keeping, which is really this wording that I'm getting out of John here, this feeding and tending. If you really get into that, this is kind of the same idea. To tend, again, in this idea, God is created, right? God has created the garden. In this point before the fall, Adam does not have to till the ground. He doesn't have to toil. He doesn't have to sweat. He's not going to work, man. I mean, this is not a work word. Tend is not a work word. Tend is like an overseeing. Tend is a taking care of. Tend would even be a shepherding kind of idea. He's overseeing. He's taking care of. When the fruit comes, he receives it, kind of thing. But Adam's not doing anything pre-fall now, pre-Genesis 3. He's not growing anything. He's not digging anything here. God is doing all the work here. It's all God's deal. So he's in the garden. He puts them in the garden to tend it, to keep it. Cultivate is probably another word. Cultivate, though, kind of talks about, seems like work to me. Cultivating something. But this really isn't. Tending it and keeping it. Overseeing, taking care of. The Lord commanded the man, saying this. Now here he gives Adam this command. Remember, as he puts him in the garden to oversee it, to tend it, to take care of it. He says what? Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day that you eat of it you shall surely die. And the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone.
That's right.
I will make him a helper comparable to him. So in this command to not do something, right? To do everything except this, right on the heels of that, he brings up this thought of what? Accountability. I mean, that's what he's doing. He's going to he needs to bring him a helper. It's not good that you should be alone. It's not good, let me say it, that you should not be accountable, right?
Yeah.
It's not good. God says it's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. So out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every bird of the air, brought them to Adam to see what he'd call them, and whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. So Adam gave names to all the cattle, to the birds of the air, to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him. So of all the creatures that God had created thus far, none of them was found to be a helper comparable to Adam. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, closed up the flesh in its place, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from man he made into a woman. And he brought her to man. And Adam said, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. You shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So in order for God to find a helper comparable to him, he took the rib from Adam and created woman. You just don't get much more intimate than that, do you? I mean, biologically speaking, we're what? Exactly the same except for a chromosome? Is that how, does anybody remember that? How that works? Is there a chromosome difference?
I think that's about right.
Is that about right?
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, when I did my physiological psych class, we saw all the different stages. So here I was in a secular school looking at this secular book, and it really solidified my belief in when life began. I'm like, wait a second. So I did a study on it for class, because it's like, wait a minute. To me, life began as soon as I saw the heartbeat. I mean, the heart beats. When you can see it, that seat of our very lives, when that just creates, and then from that, how the fetus began to grow and so forth. It was really interesting to see that, and it just solidified it for me. Of course, Scripture does too, but I thought that was interesting as a new Christian back then to see that. So here's this picture. So here's this God's plan. So it's like, here he has Adam to tend and keep all that's in the garden. Now woman is created as his helper, accountability partner, if you will, comparable to him. And then here you go into chapter 3, and here's the test.
Wow.
It's almost as if you could say, do you love me? Do you love me? Then out of every tree of the garden you can eat except for this one. Right? I mean, do you love me? Then take care of each other. Be accountable to one another. So Genesis 3 shows up. And God's words are taken and twisted. The woman is deceived. Adam sins. And there's the fall. And if you go from there all the way back up to John now, it's like it's the same message. It's like, why does Jesus say things like, what's the first and greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second, likewise, love your neighbor as yourself, right?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the picture you get from that? So again, that's why we're keeping this all under the title of Salvation through Transformational Accountability. See, this is what Jesus is calling these guys to in John 21 is so much more than a social activity. So much more than, hey, they just need a meal this morning, so we're going to go ahead and take care of their physical needs first. It's so much more than that. And I think we're going to see that even greater when we get into this idea of the lambs and the sheep. I was reading ahead a little bit. I got time to tell you. One scholar talked about, well, the reason why he's saying lambs is because that'd be the young ones. And I said, okay, I'll go with that. And the other one was sheep. And the reason why it's sheep is those are the older ones. And it takes a lot more to take care of an older person than a younger person. I'm like, I don't know if I'd agree with that. I don't know if I can really get that out of Scripture. I think what they're getting out of, if we read on in verse 18, after he says, feed my sheep in verse 17, Jesus goes on to say, most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished, but when you were old, you stretched out your hand, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can get that picture of an older person, we just had an example of that, right? Being helped, right? Out, someone to help them, right? But look what John writes. This Jesus spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God, but not by who's the he there? Who's he talking to? Peter, right? Verse 19. So Jesus spoke, signifying by what death Peter would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Now, you guys know the story with Peter coming to the end times of his life, right?
Yes.
Peter's a much older man when he dies, right? And all the disciples were taken places where they really wished not to go, right? But what was the way that Peter died? Did anybody know the story of that? What did he say?
He was hung upside down.
Yeah.
Because he said that he wasn't worthy to be hung the same way his master.
Yeah. So So that, knowing that gives me a whole lot more meaning when we get into the lamb and the sheep thing than just saying, oh, well, that's the older ones and the younger ones kind of thing. Because of the explanation of reading, this is why it's so important to read the text in the entirety of the concept or what the story is here. So this is so much more than, hey, it takes a lot more to take care of an older person than a younger person. I would venture to say that maybe we should spend more time with the younger people so that they get grounded, so that when they're older, they're the ones that are really doing the teaching. Not that they need more teaching or more feeding. I don't know, just a thought. We'll talk about it more later. So anyway, so here's this picture. This tending, this overseeing. So that's why it goes back to the proposition of, hey, this is not just a social activity. We're not saying, okay, everybody get gung-ho and go buy some extra food this week, and if you see somebody that's homeless, go give it to them, kind of thing, to make you feel better. That's not what we're talking about. Here's what we're saying. You seek the heart of God. You get on your face and you cry out to God. And be reminded of this story that says you cannot fish. You cannot live without Jesus. Without Him, without His Spirit living and breathing in and through you, you will just merely exist. That should be a fear, a negative fear that we should have. That we would just go through life merely existing. You should be afraid of that. You should be afraid of one day being 85 years old, walking up to an altar of prayer, and just heard a sermon and say, I cannot believe that I've called myself a Christian for 85 years and I have not been anything like it. That should make you fearful. So if we get on our faces and we cry out to God each and every day and cry out that He lives His life in us and through us, that we don't make choices ourselves, decisions ourselves. Man, we don't even butter our bread this morning without Him just doing it. I mean, really get right down to every jot and tittle of our very being. And just begin to live in this flow, because this is the picture. I mean, that was the picture in Genesis, that outside of me, you step outside of my protection, you step outside of my command, out of my word, out of my presence, you will crash and burn. So we get on our faces, we cry out to God, and then we go and allow Him to do what He wants to do in us and through us all the week long. And the times we come back together, we celebrate those things together. And that encourages each of us. That helps each of us. Then we see the kingdom beginning to grow again. We begin to draw others in to the fold, where we can be a place where they feel like this is a place where they need to be. We just don't want numbers for numbers' sake. We want those who God draws to us so that we can train them up and continue to send them out, making disciples. Feed, tend, feed. So let's see if we can focus on those thoughts this week as we go in and out and all the stuff we do, work and school and shop and run around. Even when we're alone, even when there's just two of us together, reminding ourselves of the command to feed, tend, and feed each other, allowing the transformed life of Jesus to do that in us and through us. Love you, Jesus. Got to believe that without you, I am totally lost. I love what John Wesley said, second without Jesus, and I'm the devil again. Man. Can't believe that and go out and try to sin safely, that's for sure. Jesus, I believe we are ready to receive the outpouring of the harvest that's in our city. That you're preparing in our families, that you're preparing in our schools with our friends, in our workplaces, with those we've worked for so many years. We are preparing ourselves to receive that outpouring, to draw the net in, so that we can continue to make disciples, continue to feed and tend those around us, to see souls saved and lives transformed, to be healthy disciples making healthy disciples. The key is allowing you to do it in us and through us. So we don't get discouraged, so we don't become dismayed, so we don't get tired out and burned out. But it's not just an act of ministry, it's not just something that we do, a social activity, but it truly is our way of life. Jesus, everything you did was a way of life. It wasn't just something you did for a season or for this or for that. But you did what you did because it was your way of life. That's why we say stuff like Jesus didn't do what he did on earth because he was God, although we believed he's God. Jesus did what he did on earth because he was a man filled with the Spirit of God. And he himself said, I don't do anything except what the Father wants to do in and through me. Why should we say anything less than that? So all we can do again is go back to Romans 12 and offer ourselves living sacrifices, holy and acceptable unto you. Our spiritual act of worship. So that we will not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds, so that we may prove to the world around us what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of you, Almighty God, in our lives. We said last week or the week before that we're the love letters of Jesus, man. We're the sweet smelling aroma of Jesus. May it be so. Trust you, Jesus. No matter what. In your name we pray.